What's up, guys? Welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. I'm your host Caleb. If you guys want to support the channel, you can click on that whatnot link in the description down below. You'll get a free $15 whenever you sign up, and you'll be supporting the channel. Additionally, you can become a patron. That is the best way to support the channel. Special shout out to my high contributing patrons. Newsom, you rock. Now let's get into today's Deck Tech with Coram the Undertaker. And guys, this is by far one of my most favorite Jund commanders we've gotten in a long time, and honestly one of the most powerful ones as well. It's very easy to bin a creature that's 18, 40, even above 40 power, and then boom, you've got access to a 40 power commander in the command zone. And then you take into account his other utility. He mills you consistently, and then once per turn you're able to cast a spell that's been milled this turn. Notably, that does work for our opponents, so if we breach the multiverse, we get 40 cards to look at and then cast. Another thing that we're going to be doing in this deck is sacrificing him and recasting him a ton for value using our greater good effects. Whenever you sacrifice him and recast him, it resets his ability, and then we can then cast more things from our graveyard. And then we're just going to layer the crap out of this deck and make it to where with any meaningful graveyard, we are going to win the game. I do want to talk about a few synergies before we get into the deck tech. One of my new favorite ones is 6 with Gitrog and Life from the Loam. Now, what's going to happen here is as long as we have Life from the Loam in our graveyard or in our hand, we just go ahead and retrace any card we want. When that land hits the graveyard, it triggers Gitrog, we draw a card, but then we just dredge our Life from the Loam back to our hand. This can make it to where, again, our graveyard is our hand now, and we can cast anything we want. Add in an Anger and maybe a Savala Heart of the Wilds with a sack outlet, and you're looking at casting your entire library. This deck just does stuff like that in several different ways. We also are using the new Infested Thrynax. Remember, our commander's massive, so if we sacrifice him, we're just creating a bunch of Thrynaxes, and then whenever you add in something like an Altar of Phyrexia or Phyrexian Altar, swap that, you get to add a ton of mana to your mana pool. Not to mention, if we have Hogak in our graveyard with Infested Thrynax on our battlefield, we can kind of just generate infinite creatures. Not okay, especially when you pair it with a greater good, because now you can draw your entire deck. I don't want to spoil much more because there's a lot of synergy in this deck we have to go over. I will say though, if we get this deck to 700 likes, I will build a budget version for you budget players out there. You guys have been smashing the like game, so let's see if we can handle a heftier goal. Let's get into this deck tech. The first thing we'll need to add to this deck is ways to consistently mill, since our commander does essentially turn our mill into card advantage. Ripples of Undeath is a card new from Modern Horizons 3 that I am quickly loving. You basically get to see 3 cards a turn and get the best card you want and put that into your hand. Additionally, with our commander, you basically get to choose 2 of these cards a turn. This card's going to be amazing. Out of the tombs, not only is this kind of a combo piece that I will explain later, but this is one of the fastest ways to quickly fill that graveyard. We're milling 2, 4, 6, 8. Drop this early and you're going to have a great game. Cemetery Tampering doesn't scale like Out of the Tomb does, but this is still a very consistent way to put cards in our graveyard. And then it does kind of do the Ripples of Undeath thing with our commander, since we do get to choose one of those a turn and cast it. Burrogoyf, a solid way to mill cards consistently, and he just gets bigger throughout the game. Not to mention the life gain is kind of appreciated because we do have some ways to pay life in this deck, so incidental life gain actually is pretty powerful here. Tato Farmer is perfect in this deck. Not only does he give us rad counters that can consistently mill us, he says put target land card in a graveyard that was milled this turn onto the battlefield. Whenever our commander attacks, each player is going to mill. So as long as one of our opponents consistently mills a land, we're going to start stealing their lands, and then as long as we're making our land drop every turn, this guy's just going to be very consistent ramp in the deck. We're also on Hermit Druid. Now, we're not going to combo off with this guy. I think we're running 9 basics in the deck, but just being able to tap it and then mill a ton of cards is going to be very useful. 6 is one of the best cards in this deck. This guy can basically turn your entire graveyard into your hand. I'll explain how that works later, and you got a little taste of that in the intro, but this guy is also going to consistently mill us. Life from the Loam, very good here. This is just going to not only get all of our utility lands back from the graveyard, like Takanuma and Basilica, Seiju who endures, but it's also going to be a consistent mill piece. Moving on to our explosive mill pieces, we have Breach the Multiverse. This card can flat out win you the game in the right scenario. If we mill Lord of Extinction and Chandra's Ignition with this card and our commanders on the battlefield, boom, we've got an over 40 power commander, and we can cast Chandra's Ignition from our graveyard using our commander's ability. So we don't even have to reanimate anything, and this card could win us the game. And then on top of that, if it doesn't win us the game, this card's just some insane value here. Altar of Dementia can mill us a ton. We're playing some massive creature cards, so this can very easily kill our opponents by milling them completely out, or we can get rid of our entire library if we have Out of the Tombs on the battlefield, and then that combo piece is now online. I'll briefly explain how that Out of the Tomb combo works. Once we have 0 cards in our library, all we need is a sack outlet and a way to draw cards. There's a ton of ways to draw cards in this deck. Let's just say we have the Great Henge on the battlefield for argument's sake. So Out of the Tombs, Great Henge, and Altar of Dementia. Now whenever we reanimate a creature card from our graveyard, it's going to trigger the Great Henge. The Great Henge will draw a card, which will trigger Out of the Tombs and reanimate a creature from the graveyard. Now we can reanimate our entire graveyard. We do need a sack outlet because whenever we run out of creatures to reanimate, we do lose the game. So with any sack outlet, this is just going to net us infinite die triggers, infinite ETBs, and infinite bodies to sacrifice. Once we get here, we can win a plethora of ways. We have Terror of the Peaks, Rakdos joins up, and even just Altar of Dementia milling everybody's libraries is going to get us there. And again, remember, we don't have to use the Great Henge for this. Anything that's going to draw us cards will work. Even something like a Selvala, since we have the biggest creature guaranteed, is going to do the job here. Even a creature card that draws you cards like Disciple of Freelease is going to be solid. It enters the battlefield, you sack it with the ETB trigger on the stack, and then off of the cards you drew, make sure you reanimate Disciple of Freelease again, along with, let's say, 4 or 5 other creatures, and as long as you sacrifice all of them with her card draw ability on the stack, you're good to go. Moving on, we have Bramble Familiar. I love this card. Early game, it's a solid mana dork, and then late game, you're going to mill a ton of cards and reanimate a massive creature. This card's honestly perfect in this deck. Doom Whisperer is very good as well. Remember, our commander doesn't just trigger off of mill, he triggers off of anything that puts a card from our library directly into the graveyard. Surveil puts cards from our library directly into the graveyard. So this is kind of a Grizzle brand in this deck. You can just keep surveilling cards until you find the card that you need, and then just straight up cast it. This card's not going to be okay in this deck. Then we have our targeted Entomb effects like Buried Alive, Entomb, and Lively Dirge. This just grabs our biggest creatures in our library and shoves them directly into the graveyard. Now we have a massive commander. Then we're going to have a couple more generic ways to fill the graveyard that doesn't necessarily trigger our commander, like Brass's Tunnel Grinder. We're going to discard a ton of cards, but our commander doesn't really care about discard effects. Faithless Looting, very good in the early game. Let's say one of those massive creatures gets stuck in our hand. We can pay 1 mana and instantly shove it into the graveyard. That's going to be perfect for this deck. The Great Door kind of does the same thing. Comes down early, provides value, gets those big pieces in the graveyard, and then late game we turn this over and it's going to provide a ton of mana. Fauna Shaman, again, finds out those big creatures, puts them in the graveyard, and it's even going to find us our anger and put it in the graveyard. This deck just gets way more powerful when you give every single thing haste. Chainer Nightmare Adept kind of does 2 things in this deck. It's a solid reanimator that also gives that creature's haste. Remember, we are on Souls of the Lost, so just being able to discard a card and then cast a 2 CMC creature that's over 40 power is very powerful. And then additionally, it gives anything we reanimate haste. So any creature we cast from the graveyard using our commander's ability will now have haste. Insidious Roots, honestly, I'm not sold on this card yet, but I wanted to try it out, and this is going to be a solid deck to try it out in. Every time we remove a creature from our graveyard, we're just going to get a mana dork, essentially. Now, honestly, this deck might be too fast for this to ever matter, but again, I want to give it a try. Without further ado, let's get into the fun part of this deck. All of the Power Matters synergies. The Gitrog Ravenous Ride is going to be perfect. We're going to sacrifice our 18 power commander, draw 18 cards, shove 18 lands into play, and our opponents are not going to be able to catch up after that. Greven Praetor Captain. Again, we have a little bit of life loss here, but losing 18 life to draw 18 cards kind of just gets you there, and you will win the game shortly after that. Greater Good, just a solid way to sacrifice our powerful creatures to draw a ton of cards, and then it gets our key pieces into the graveyard, right? Even if we sacrifice a 1/1, discarding 3 cards in this deck can be very powerful. Disciple of Freelease, not only is she way hotter than Disciple of Bolas, but she's also on a land, so the flexibility is just going to be insane here. Clouth, Unrivaled Ancient, all the mana. You'll just have all of it. This guy attacks, you add 20 plus mana to your mana pool, sometimes even 40. If this guy hits the battlefield and you have anything meaningful in your graveyard, you will just win the game. Selvala, Heart of the Wilds is very powerful here. She's going to add a ton of mana to our mana pool, and the card draw ability is actually going to be useful here since our commander is 9 times out of 10 going to be the biggest thing on the battlefield. So he enters the battlefield, we get our card advantage, we add a ton of mana to our mana pool, 1 or 2 turns of Selvala sticking, you're just going to win the game. If you have Anger in the graveyard, you've probably already won the game. The Reaver Cleaver, our commander doesn't have trample, but he has a ton of power. So all we have to do is equip the Reaver Cleaver to our commander, add a ton of mana to our mana pool, and probably kill an opponent in the process. Ruthless Technomancer has insane synergy with our commander. Our commander has 0 power in the graveyard. Kind of insane to me, but that's kind of what it is. And so that makes it to where we can reanimate our commander just with 3 mana with Ruthless Technomancer, along with sacrificing an artifact. So if he has 18 or even 40 power, we generate 18 to 40 treasure tokens off of our commander, and then we sacrifice our commander, and then we just reanimate him again. Not okay. With 6 on the battlefield, this makes a game-winning board state, especially when the sack outlet is Greater Good, because you're drawing into more lands, you're sacrificing Ruthless Technomancer and your commander to generate mana, and you just kind of get there. Terror of the Peaks is very good here. It just flat kills people. Remember, there's a couple ways in the deck to generate infinite ETBs, so he's going to kill our opponents there. And then additionally, we have 40 power creatures in the graveyard. All we have to do is reanimate our commander, and boom, we kill 1 player. Not okay. Infested Thrynax is kind of insane in this deck with our effects like Terror of the Peaks. Additionally, we do have Phyrexian Altar in this deck, so with Infested Thrynax and Phyrexian Altar, we can generate insane amounts of mana. Like, it almost does a food chain impression because we sacrifice our commander, we get 18 1/1s that we can then sacrifice for 18 mana, then we can just cast our commander for 6 mana, sacrifice him again, and then boom, we're gonna get 18 more 1/1s. It's kind of insane. You're gonna generate 19 mana every time you do this, and as long as we can cast our commander from our graveyard using something like 6, and then again maybe we need something to draw cards into, or even if we have a way to draw cards and we have Life from the Loam in hand, we can kind of keep just casting our commander from the graveyard and generate infinite mana. What we've done here is really just created a deck that wins with any meaningful graveyard. It's kind of insane. Because what I want you guys to remember, I know I said it at the start of the video, but now that we've gone halfway through the deck tech, I just wanted to re-mention that recasting our commander resets his ability. So if we mill a ton of cards, we're able to cast all of those as long as we're able to sacrifice our commander and recast him. The Skullspore Nexus, really good here. It just doubles our commander's power, and then we're going to get a massive dinosaur whenever that commander dies. And then we can double the power of that dinosaur to get more insane value. This card's just going to win us the game very quickly in this deck, along with Railway Brawler. Turns out just doubling everybody's power for 4 or 5 mana, not okay, especially when it's in the form of counters. We don't really utilize that here, but it is worth noting. Altar of the Wretched, really good. We're going to basically draw double cards since our commander lets us cast those cards from our graveyard, so we can just sacrifice an 18 power creature and draw upwards to 36 cards. I know it's drawing 18 and milling 18, but again, with our commander, it's kind of like just drawing all of it, and then we have 6. 6 just basically turns our graveyard into our hand with this. Not to mention, it does have Wretched Bone Mass. Now, I would only craft this if you're trying to win the game with something like a Chandra's Ignition or a Terror of the Peaks, because it will exile our key pieces that we need to make our commander big. So only fuse this in a scenario where you're trying to win the game. Other than that, don't mess with it. The Great Hinge, solid card advantage, solid ramp, and then we can really utilize that incidental life gain in this deck. Fanatic of Ronas. Now, this is a new card that just taps for 4 mana if you have a 4 power creature on the battlefield. That's almost going to be always in this deck, so this guy is definitely a welcome include. Chandra's Ignition, again, there's several ways that this just wins us the game. And if it doesn't win us the game, it's just going to wipe the entire board. In this next section, we're going to go over our commander-centric cards and how to assemble our value engines. So make sure you watch till the end for this one. First of all, we have our big giant creatures that we're just trying to get in the graveyard. Hogak Arisen Nightmare, Yargle in Multani, Lord of Extinction, and Ghalta Primal Hunger are going to be perfect, along with Souls of the Lost. Kind of insane that Souls of the Lost is 2 mana because there's several ways to just reanimate this for, again, 2 mana or even free in this deck. So just reanimating something that's going to be over 40 power, not okay. And you can kind of see, I know I've been saying over 40 power again and again in this deck, but I promise that happens all the time. It's not just maybe in the right scenario or Magical Christmas Land. No, it's very easy to get our commander over 40 power in this deck. Goblin Engineer has several notable targets, so I had to include him. He gets the Reaver Cleaver, he can get Altar of the Wretched, even our Altar of Dementia, our Altar or our Phyrexian Altar. Again, there's just several very key pieces that this guy can get, and he has that powerful ETB that lets us get our most impactful piece that we need at the time. Notably, one of my favorite things to do with this guy if we're going for the long game is just keep looping Altar of the Wretched and Brass's Tunnel Grinder again and again for some insane card advantage. Let's talk about the Gitrog monster. There's a couple reasons this guy is in the deck, and then we'll go over one of the ways to turn our graveyard into our hand using this guy. First of all, playing the additional land, pretty useful here. The card advantage, very useful with the mill strategy. And then again, he kind of does synergize pretty good with our commander since he allows us to play our opponent's lands. Now, let's get into why this guy is going to be very good here. If we get into a scenario where we have Life from the Loam in the graveyard, 6 on the battlefield, and then Gitrog monster on the battlefield, we've essentially made our graveyard our hand. Whenever you go ahead to retrace a card from your graveyard, you have to discard a land, which is going to trigger the card draw ability of the Gitrog monster, and then you just dredge Life from the Loam, putting that back into your hand, which is an insane interaction on its own because we're going to put 3 more cards into our graveyard, and then additionally that puts 3 land cards in our hand that we're discarding to retrace more things from our graveyard. So this whole scenario effectively draws us 5 cards, which is again insane. And then once we've turned our entire graveyard into our hand, our only hiccup is going to be mana, which as you've seen is not going to be an issue here. If we have Selvala with Anger in the graveyard and a sack outlet, we can just tap Selvala for 18 mana, sacrifice Selvala, retrace Selvala, tap Selvala for 18 mana, and you generate infinite mana this way. Same thing with Ruthless Technomancer. It's a little bit more mana intensive, but with an 11 power commander that does net you infinite mana because we cast our commander from the graveyard, then we cast Life from the Loam, which is 2 mana, so now we're at 6, and then we cast Ruthless Technomancer, which is going to put us all the way up to, you guessed it, 10 mana. So again, 11 power commander, not hard in this deck, generates us infinite mana as well. I know that sounds like a lot of pieces to get this together, but it's really not. All we need is the Gitrog monster, Life from the Loam, and then 6 to really just start filling our graveyard. And then the fact that we're shoving 5 cards into our graveyard, or sorry, 3 cards into our graveyard, and then drawing 2 cards every time we do this interaction is just going to find us our key pieces. Chthonian Nightmare, another broken card I'm giving a shot. This thing's insanely busted here. If you want to reanimate something like a 1 CMC creature and then a 4 CMC Ruthless Technomancer, you can do that. You can grab your Goblin Engineer and start kind of looping it through the graveyard. There's a lot of kind of crazy things we can do, especially with Souls of the Lost, since it cares about CMC and not how powerful the creature is. And again, this is kind of broken with Selvala because you can cast Selvala, tap it for mana, then you go ahead and sacrifice Selvala to bring back Souls of the Lost, and you can kind of get into scenarios where again you generate infinite ETBs and infinite die triggers. You just need to make sure Anger is in the graveyard. Goldvein Hydra didn't really need to be in this deck, but kind of a cool card, so I shoved it in the deck. It's a massive creature. You sacrifice it, you get a ton of treasure tokens to set up for the next turn. Korvold's also going to see play in this deck. Sometimes we can generate insane mana using stuff like the Reaver Cleaver or even Ruthless Technomancer, but then we don't don't have any cards or anything to cast with that mana, well, now Korvold gets rid of that problem. We just start sacrificing treasure tokens, digging deep into our library, finding all of our key pieces, and while we're doing this, Korvold is just going to get massive, and again, there's a ton of ways to utilize a massive creature in this deck. I do kind of want to go over a fun interaction Cavalier of Night has with Eternal Witness. If we cast Cavalier of Night, sacrificing Eternal Witness, we can then actually sacrifice Cavalier of Night to reanimate Eternal Witness that then reanimates Cavalier of Night. This can feel oppressive in some scenarios, and it will keep all of your opponent's key pieces off the board as long as they're creatures, right? We're running Exploration here, kind of self-explanatory. We can now play lands from our graveyard using our commander or our opponent's graveyard, and then we can still play lands from our hand as well. Especially with Life from the Loam, it makes it to where you can easily make that 2 land drops every turn very consistently, and it just kind of catapults you ahead of your opponents. Rakdos Joins Up is kind of a win con. That's a solid reanimation piece as well. We can reanimate our very expensive commander, deal a ton of damage to our opponents, and then in the right scenario where we're looping our commander or legendary creatures in and out of the graveyard, we're just going to win the game with this. Shifting Woodlands is kind of messed up. It's just free and it's on a land, and when you're in a graveyard centric strategy, I think this is almost going to be an auto include. There's a lot of ways that 3 or even maybe sometimes 4 cards gets us there and we just win the game, but maybe sometimes one of those is in the graveyard. Well, now Shifting Woodlands can be that card. Kind of stupid. Pathbreaker Ibex, very simple. This is just going to win us the game with any meaningful board state and any meaningful card in our graveyard. Giving our entire board plus 18 is going to win us the game, and then again, that's kind of the low end of this deck. We're probably more likely making our entire board state plus 40, and then sending 3 creatures in each direction, winning the game instantly. That's going to do it for the deck tech, guys. I did kind of try to go in depth with this deck tech and talk about all the interactions where we can generate some insane value engines. So if you guys appreciated that, make sure to drop a comment, let me know, and leave a like on the video. Shout out to my high contributing patrons, Newsome, Excessum, Chicken Salad, and Creator. You guys are amazing. I hope this helped you guys in your deck building endeavors, and I will see you in the next one.